Steam curls from a chipped coffee pot as Ella wipes down the counter for the third time, her reflection fractured in the streaked chrome. The diner hums low, the kind of morning sound that belongs to people who gave up on hurry a long time ago. Snow drifts sideways outside the window, soft as breath, swallowing the world beyond Main Street. Then the bell above the door rings. A man steps in, tall, out of place, his coat dark with melting snow. He pauses, scanning the room as though searching for something he's lost. His watch glints under the yellow light. His shoes don't belong to this town. Ella's rag stills mid-swipe. For a moment, it's just the two of them, her heartbeat against the hum of the heater, his silence carrying more weight than words. He looks up. "Thank you, Ella," he says softly. But she never told him her name. Before we continue our story, let's welcome our viewers from Australia, and our viewers in the United States, Trinidad and Tobago, Nigeria, the United Kingdom, and Canada. Your loyalty, strength, and spirit have built the foundation of this channel. Every view, comment, and share is a heartbeat in this story we're building together. Now let's go back to our characters. The snow had softened by mid-morning, falling in slow, thoughtful flakes outside the diner's wide front window. Inside, the heat hummed low, the smell of coffee and baked bread wrapping the place in warmth that felt older than Ella herself. It had been 3 days since the man in the dark coat had walked in, spoken her name without asking, and left her wondering who he really was. Now he was back. James Hartwell, though she still didn't know his last name, sat in the same booth by the window, a folded newspaper beside his untouched plate. He didn't look like he belonged in Jackson Hole. Not the way locals did, with snow crusted on boots and hands scarred from work. His clothes were too fine, his voice too measured. But there was something else about him, something tired in his eyes, as though he carried too much of the world inside him and had nowhere left to set it down. "Morning," Ella said softly, pouring his coffee. He smiled faintly. "Morning, Ella." She pretended not to notice the way he said her name, as if it was something he'd practiced. "You want your eggs the same way?" He nodded. "You remember." "I remember my regulars," she replied, though they both knew he wasn't one. Not yet. Days turned into weeks, and soon James was a quiet fixture in that window booth. He came every morning around 9, always alone, always with the same air of a man hiding in plain sight. Sometimes he read the paper, sometimes he just stared out at the snow, as if waiting for it to cover something he wished to forget. He started asking questions. Not the kind people from money usually asked. "Do you ever leave town?" he'd ask. "What's the farthest you've ever been?" "Bozeman," she said once, refilling his coffee. "Had a cousin there. Didn't stay long." He smiled. "Why not?" Ella shrugged. "Didn't belong there." "Do you feel like you belong here?" She looked out the window then, at the trucks passing by, the same faces she'd served since she was 17. "It's not about belonging," she said finally. "It's about staying." He studied her, like her answer meant more than she intended. Between orders, Ella found herself glancing at him. Not because he was handsome, though he was, but because he seemed like someone holding his breath. And she knew that feeling too well. One afternoon, the diner emptied early. Millie, the older cook, wiped her hands and said she'd head home before the next snowstorm. The clock above the counter ticked softly in the quiet. James stayed. "Must be lonely work," he said, stirring his coffee. "What work isn't?" she replied, leaning against the counter. He hesitated before asking, "How long have you been here?" 10 years, she said. "Started at 16. My dad needed help after Mom left. Guess I never stopped. He nodded slowly, eyes softening. My father left too, but for different reasons. She raised a brow. And what reasons would those be? He wanted more, James said simply. And I wanted less. That night, after closing, Ella found herself thinking about that answer. The way he said it, not bitterly, not proudly, just tiredly honest. She went home to her small apartment above the hardware store and sat by the window, watching snow fall on Main Street. Somewhere out there, that man with the quiet eyes was doing the same. Weeks passed. The town noticed, of course. Small towns always do. A man like James coming in every morning, always asking for Ella. The waitress who never looked twice at anyone, now smiling a little longer when she poured his coffee. It wasn't romance yet. Not even close. It was something slower, quieter. Two lives that brushed against each other and recognized the same ache. One Sunday, the diner was nearly empty when he walked in without his coat, sleeves rolled, tie undone. He looked human. Not polished, not unreachable. Just tired. Rough day? She asked. He chuckled softly. Rough decade. Ella smiled before she could stop herself. That bad? He looked at her then, really looked. You ever feel like everyone's waiting for you to be someone you're not? Her smile faded. Every day. He exhaled, the sound almost like relief. Then maybe that's why I'm here. She didn't know what he meant, and he didn't explain. But something shifted that day. After that, he stayed longer. Sometimes until closing. Sometimes until Millie gave her a knowing look before heading home. They talked about little things at first. Wyoming winters, favorite books, the best pie crust recipes. But as the days grew colder, their conversations reached quieter truths. He told her he used to live in New York. That he built something that made him rich but cost him peace. That he came west to breathe again, though he wasn't sure how. Ella told him about her father, how debt had swallowed him, how the farm was lost, how she'd promised herself she wouldn't dream too big anymore. Dreams, she said, were like expensive coats, nice to look at but useless in the cold if they don't fit your life. James listened without interrupting. And for the first time in a long time, Ella felt seen, not as the waitress with kind eyes and steady hands, but as someone who had once wanted more and had quietly chosen less. The first time he laughed, really laughed, she caught herself smiling so wide her cheeks hurt. It was a small sound, rough and boyish, and it made her heart ache in ways she didn't understand. Winter deepened. The snow piled high against the windows, muffling the world outside. Each morning, she found herself glancing at the door before it opened, pretending she wasn't waiting. On one of those mornings, James reached across the booth and placed a small coin on the table. It was old, worn smooth. My father gave me this, he said. Said it reminded him to keep something real close by, something that doesn't lose its shine when the world does. She brushed her thumb over its faded surface. And what about you? He smiled faintly. I guess I lost mine somewhere along the way. She handed the coin back. Maybe you're meant to find it again. He looked at her then, a quiet warmth in his gaze that said he already had. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft and endless. Inside, 2 cups of coffee cooled between them, one nearly full, one untouched. Neither of them said it aloud, but both knew something had begun. And though Ella couldn't name it, she felt it, like the faint hum beneath the diner's old heater, steady and impossible to ignore. Ella found the napkin tucked beneath the sugar jar that evening, folded so precisely it looked like it had been pressed under a book for years. In James' careful handwriting, simple and deliberate, it read, "Can we meet after closing?" Her stomach nodded as she set it aside, pretending to continue wiping down the counter, though every muscle in her body wanted to run to the door. The diner was quiet now, just the hum of the heater and the occasional scrape of a chair as a late customer shuffled toward the exit. Outside, snow pressed against the windows, thick and soft, blurring the street into shades of gray and white. She lingered for a moment, imagining what might await her. Then, as the last of the customers left and Millie turned out the lights, she stepped outside, drawing her coat tight around her. The air was bitter, crisp, and clean, making each breath sharp in her lungs. A flickering yellow streetlight cast long shadows across the icy sidewalk, illuminating the small alley behind the diner where James waited. He looked smaller here than in the diner, unguarded somehow, shoulders hunched against the cold. She noticed the way the light hit his cheekbones, the faint line of fatigue beneath his eyes. For a moment, the world felt suspended, the only sound their mutual breath rising and falling in visible clouds. "Evening," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Evening," he replied, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I thought you might not come." "I had to," she whispered, shoving her hands deeper into her coat pockets. "I didn't know what else to do." They walked a few steps together, the crunch of snow beneath their boots the only sound. He gestured toward a bench tucked beneath the side of the building, where the snow had not yet fully covered the wooden slats. She sat first, brushing the wet flakes from her coat. He sat opposite her, close enough to feel warmth, far enough to keep an invisible line of propriety. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he began, voice low, almost hesitant. "I just needed someone who sees things clearly. Someone who remembers what's important." Ella let her gaze drift downward, noticing the edges of a notebook peeking from the inside of his coat pocket. It had been there for weeks, always closed, always untouched. "That's the one you never write in," she said softly. He chuckled, the sound more like relief than amusement. "I try. Every day. But when I open it, I remember all the ways I've failed to do the things I thought I could control." She understood that feeling. Her hands absently played with the edge of her own apron in memory, the frayed hem that never quite frayed enough, the apron she had stitched back together herself, over and over. Some things just don't follow the plans we make," she said. James looked at her then, really looked, as though she had said something he needed to hear but had forgotten to ask for. "Exactly," he said. "And yet we keep trying, don't we?" Their words lingered, unfinished, like smoke curling toward the sky. Then, slowly, the conversation turned. He spoke of the company he had built, of the boardrooms that swallowed him whole, the investors who demanded growth at the cost of people's lives, the endless cycle of meetings and decisions that never felt right. His voice faltered sometimes, just slightly, when he admitted the loneliness that came with it. Ella, in turn, admitted her own fears. "I feel invisible," she said. "Like no one ever notices me beyond the diner walls, beyond the small town I've never left." She laughed quietly, but there was nothing happy in it. "I want to be seen, James. Even just a little." He reached for the notebook again, brushing a finger over the leather cover. "I know the feeling. You build walls around yourself, thinking it keeps people out, and then you realize you've shut the world from everything good, too." They sat together in silence for a long moment, snowflakes landing on shoulders, eyelashes, hair, unnoticed in the cold night. It was intimate without gesture, unspoken yet heavier than words. Then, without thinking, Ella reached out, brushing her hand against his as it rested on the bench. He didn't pull away. "I Thank you, she whispered, her fingers retreating but still near enough that warmth lingered. He nodded. You don't need to thank me. Tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe. Your support helps us bring you more powerful stories. Stay tuned, because tomorrow's story is one you won't want to miss. Thank you very much. Now, let us return to our main character. For nights after, they returned to that small meeting place, drawn by the quiet and the space where the world could not intrude. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they simply watched the snow settle, listening to their own heartbeats over the hush of falling flakes. Shared laughter came softly, tucked between sentences. Gestures, small, careful, spoke louder than confessions. A hand lingered on a sleeve, a shoulder brushed during a conversation. A quiet smile held just long enough to matter. Yet the town began to notice subtle signs. A black SUV idled near the diner once, engine off, windows tinted dark. Shadows that didn't belong drifted past the glass, stopping long enough to watch. A flash of a camera sometimes caught them unaware. Rumors began, whispered at the counter or muttered at the hardware store. Ella felt the weight of each look, each side glance, press upon her chest. One evening, as they sat behind the diner once more, James' eyes met hers in a gravity she could not ignore. They can't find out about you, he said quietly, almost pleading. Not them. Ella's heart lurched. Then who am I allowed to be? He did not answer immediately. Only the snow moved, drifting softly to cover footprints. He let the question hang between them, unbroken, as if the air itself held the truth they could not speak aloud. The secret they were forming was tender, fragile, and dangerous. They knew it, and in that hush of falling snow, beneath the flickering streetlight, each recognized how close they were to something that could never belong in the daylight. Time began to fold differently. Nights were longer, the snow heavier, the world quieter. The notebook remained closed, a silent witness to the lives they had yet to admit to living. The diner felt smaller in its familiarity, larger in the shadows of what they carried together. Every glance became a conversation, every brush of fingers a confession. And though no words were spoken about the love growing between them, it was undeniable, something alive, delicate, consuming them quietly from the inside. Yet, for all its warmth, the world waited just beyond the streetlight. The whispers in town would not stay quiet forever, and the shadows at the edge of the snow hinted at the day when their hidden lives would be discovered. Ella looked at James, a mixture of fear and hope tightening her chest. I don't know how long we can keep this, she said. He smiled softly, almost sad. Then we keep it for now. That's all anyone can do. For a moment, the world shrank to the space between the flickering light and the quiet snow. And for the first time in years, Ella felt like someone had truly seen her. And maybe, just maybe, someone she could see back. The morning paper hit the diner counter like a cold slap. Ella's hand froze as she unfolded it. Bold letters, black against white, screamed from the front page. Billionaire CEO seen in town with local waitress. The words blurred at first, then sharpened painfully. Faces pressed to the glass as customers whispered, pointing in muted shock. Her stomach twisted. The coffee in her hand trembled. Then the bell above the door rang, and James stepped in. The diner fell silent. Cups stopped clinking, chairs ceased scraping. Even the old clock on the wall seemed to pause. Every eye followed him, curious and judgmental. He glanced around, saw Ella behind the counter, and for a brief instant, their eyes locked. Her heart thudded in her chest. He gave her the faintest nod, a shadow of apology, then turned and walked out without a word. Ella's knees weakened. The air felt heavier, charged. She closed the diner early, telling Millie she wasn't feeling well, though it was more than that. She needed to see him. The drive to the cabin was short, the snow-slick roads reflecting the gray sky above. She pulled into the small clearing and saw the light through the windows dim, uneven. The door creaked as she stepped inside, and the familiar smell of pine and wood smoke met her, though it was faint as if neglected. He was sitting in the chair by the hearth, tie undone, sleeves rolled up, a glass of untouched whiskey at his side. The fire flickered weakly, shadows dancing on the walls, mirroring the turmoil she felt inside. "James," she said, voice soft. He didn't answer. His head remained down, fingers tracing the rim of the glass. The notebook she had come to recognize as a silent witness rested unopened on the table beside him. She swallowed hard. "We can't. Ignore it. They're saying things about us. Everyone is." Her voice broke, but she pressed on. "Everyone knows." He looked up, and for the first time, she saw the man behind the careful composure, the weight of responsibilities, of expectations, of betrayals. His eyes were raw, weary, and haunted. "I thought I could protect you," he said quietly, each word deliberate. "I thought the world could never touch this, our time, if I just kept it hidden. But now," his voice cracked, "now it's out, and I can't shield you anymore." Ella stepped closer. "Then what are we going to do? Just let them tear this apart." He shook his head, the motion slow, heavy. "If I stay, if I don't step back, it'll destroy you. My name, my company, the scrutiny. You'd be buried under it all." She felt a lump rise in her throat. "And if you go," she asked softly, trembling, "you'll destroy what's real between us. You know it." He looked down at the notebook, then back at her. "The board. They've been waiting for a mistake. They're using this, us, against me. They say I've lost focus, that I'm unfit to lead. This is bigger than either of us. I can't fight it without dragging you into it." She pressed her hand to her chest, feeling her heartbeat racing, the firelight flickering across her face. "So we're supposed to just stop caring? Pretend none of this happened. Pretend it didn't exist, maybe. That's all I can do to keep you safe." Her shoulders shook, tears threatening. "I never asked to be safe. I asked to be seen, to matter." He reached toward her, and she felt the tremor in his hand. "You do matter," he whispered. "More than you know. That's why this hurts so much. Because I can't give you what the world demands of me without risking everything you are." They moved closer, drawn by gravity, by the undeniable connection that had grown between them. The fire flickered, light and shadow playing across their faces, as if it mirrored the fragile state of their secret, burning bright and brief. He took a deep breath. "I wanted us to be a quiet thing, a pocket of calm in a storm I couldn't control. I wanted to share a life not defined by money, by headlines, by judgment. But they've found it." Ella rested her hand lightly on his arm, feeling the warmth beneath his sleeve. "Then maybe we just hold on to what's ours, even if the world can't see it." He shook his head. "You're stronger than you realize, Ella. But this strength, yours, is exactly why I have to leave. If I stay, it will break the life you've built, the peace you've earned." Her breath caught. "And if you leave, it will break my heart," he admitted. "But it may be the only way to keep yours intact." They sat in silence, the fire crackling weakly, filling the room with the soft, irregular rhythm of a life too full to contain. Outside, the wind pressed against the cabin, but inside, it was just them and the quiet, heavy with words neither dared to speak. James finally stood, straightening his coat, smoothing his hair as if he could erase the evening, the newspaper, the judgment. He picked up the notebook, flipping through the blank pages before letting it rest unopened on the table. "I can't leave this world behind just yet," he said softly. "But I can leave this room." Ella watched him, breath shallow, heart breaking in slow, deliberate beats. "James." He shook his head. "I have to. It's the only way you stay safe. The only way I keep from ruining us." The firelight flickered one last time as he moved toward the door. She wanted to stop him, to say something, anything, but no words came. He slipped on his coat, pulled the collar high, and opened the door. The night greeted him with a cold whisper. "Goodbye," he said, voice nearly swallowed by the wind. Ella barely nodded, tears streaking down her cheeks, fingers brushing the notebook as if holding onto it could somehow hold him too. The door closed behind him, the latch clicking shut, leaving only the faint smell of smoke and pine, and the emptiness of the cabin echoing in her chest. Morning arrived with a pale light that spilled across the cabin floor. She woke to silence, the kind that presses against the ribs, heavy and unyielding. James was gone. No note, no explanation, no lingering warmth. Only the notebook remained on the table, unopened, a quiet witness to what had been and could not be. Ella ran her fingers over the leather cover, the smooth surface cold beneath her touch. She traced the spine, the corners, imagining the words that might have filled its pages if the world had been kinder, if secrets had been safer. The notebook offered no comfort, only the echo of absence. Outside, the snow continued to fall, undisturbed and impartial. The small town waited, unaware of the cost behind the morning light. Inside, the cabin felt impossibly large, every shadow a reminder of what had been lost in a single night. And though she knew this was only the beginning of the quiet reckoning that would follow, she could not bring herself to leave the notebook behind. She placed it carefully on the table, folding her hands over it, and whispered into the empty room, "Safe for now." The fire had died completely, leaving only ashes that shifted faintly in the drafts, much like the remnants of their fragile, secret love, burned bright, but fleeting, and now only memory remained. The diner felt smaller without him. The familiar hum of conversation, the clink of spoons against mugs, even Millie bustling behind the counter, all of it seemed to press closer, crowding Ella in her solitude. Whispers followed her wherever she went. "Did you see her with him?" A customer muttered, voice low, but sharp enough to cut. "Can't believe she," another added, pausing as Ella passed, lowering eyes as if hoping to escape notice. Millie leaned close one afternoon, brushing a lock of hair from Ella's forehead as she placed a plate of pie on the counter. "Honey," she said gently, "don't let them talk too loud. They'll forget eventually, but you need to remember who you are." Ella nodded, though it felt hollow. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured coffee, gripping the pot as though it were the only anchor in the storm of stares and half-smiles. The world had moved on from the diner, but the world she'd shared with James, quiet nights, snow behind the diner, the small moments of laughter and warmth, had not. Days passed. Weeks passed. And then one crisp morning, the paper arrived again, folded neatly on the counter. She opened it with fingers she barely recognized as hers. There, in full color, smiling beside a group of sharply dressed men and women in New York, was James. His hair was combed perfectly, the lines of his suit precise, the city lights reflected in his eyes. It was a photo meant to show power, influence, success. A man she didn't know at all. Her chest tightened. Relief battled heartbreak. Relief that he was alive and seemingly well. Heartbreak that the man she had shared quiet, tender hours with, hands brushing whispers under a streetlight, laughter shared over lukewarm coffee, was gone, absorbed back into the world he had left her to protect her from. The notebook sat on the counter, unopened, a silent monument to nights now past. With shaking hands, she lifted the leather cover, letting it open naturally, the spine creaking softly in the quiet. Page after page was blank, except for the very last, where a single line was scrawled in familiar handwriting. Home is where someone remembers you. Ella's lips pressed together as tears pooled briefly in the corners of her eyes. She let the notebook close gently, placing it back on the counter. She did not cry, not yet. Instead, she let the words sink into her chest, feeling them root her in a strange, bittersweet peace. He had gone, but he had remembered her. That alone was enough to keep the ache from consuming her entirely. Winter gave way to early spring. She tended the diner, pouring coffee, washing dishes, stacking chairs, allowing the routines to absorb her. Time stretched and bent, bringing new faces, small changes, and the faint echo of snow against the windows. Yet the world beyond Jackson Hole, the world James had returned to, loomed in the photographs, the headlines, the whispers. Months later, an envelope arrived. No return address. She recognized his handwriting immediately, the careful loops and slant of each letter, even before lifting the flap. Ella, if I told you I came back to that diner a dozen times and couldn't bring myself to enter, would you believe me? I thought leaving would make things easier. It didn't. You reminded me of who I was before all of this, the man who built something with his hands, not with numbers on a page. I'm selling the company. I don't know where I'm going next, but I hope you find what peace looks like to you. You taught me what it feels like. James. She held the letter in her hands as the sun dipped low behind the Teton Mountains, spilling gold and rose across the sky. The light touched the porch where she sat, the air cool against her cheeks. Her fingers trembled, not from sadness, but from the intensity of everything she had held in for months, the longing, the love, the quiet ache of absence. She folded the letter carefully, setting it next to the notebook on the table beside her. She did not cry. Instead, she whispered softly, almost to herself, "Find peace, James." And with deliberate calm, she closed the notebook for good, letting it rest beneath the fading sunlight. Days turned to weeks, weeks to years. Ella stayed in Jackson Hole. Millie retired, passing the diner into her care, trusting her to keep the warmth alive for the townspeople. Regulars came and went, coffee continued to pour, and the little rhythms of small-town life grounded her as surely as the mountains rose against the horizon. The notebook remained in its drawer, unopened, a quiet relic of a past that had shaped her more than she could have imagined. Sometimes she would glance at it, or think of James, his eyes catching the firelight, the warmth of his hand near hers, the quiet smiles shared in snowfall. Each memory carried a weight she bore privately, like a song you can't share, but can hum quietly when no one is listening. She grew older, yes, but not weary. Life carried new responsibilities, new joys, and simple certainties. And yet, in the winter months, when the snow first fell and blanketed the town in white, her heart still remembered the warmth of those nights, the flicker of the streetlight, and the unspoken love they had shared. Then, one late autumn afternoon, the bell above the diner door rang, its familiar chime slicing through the quiet hum of conversation. Ella looked up from behind the counter, her hands resting lightly on the coffee pot. The room fell into a subtle hush, the way it always did when someone unfamiliar or unexpected arrived. A man entered, tall and careful in his movements, dusted lightly with snow. He paused, surveying the diner, not with the eyes of a stranger, but with the quiet attentiveness of someone noticing a place he had known once. Ella's breath hitched slightly. Her heart did not leap. It recognized. He approached the counter, a gentle smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Coffee?" she asked, voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside. "Black." "No sugar," he replied softly. For a long moment, neither spoke. The world outside the windows moved on, oblivious to the quiet reunion inside. No headlines, no gossip, no boardrooms intruding here. Just the snow falling, the firelight flickering faintly from the small heater in the corner, and two people who had shared a lifetime of moments now stretched across years, standing quietly in the same room again. She poured the coffee, her hand steady this time, and set it before him. He took a small sip, eyes never leaving hers, and nodded, a silent acknowledgement passing between them, one that said everything they did not need to voice. The notebook remained in its drawer, closed, resting quietly on the counter. Their love, their time together, had been written in memory, not on paper. And perhaps that was enough. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the town in white, indifferent to secrets, whispers, or hearts quietly mending. Inside, Ella felt a gentle warmth that had nothing to do with coffee or firelight. It was the warmth of knowing some truths, some loves, remain quietly theirs, even if the world will never see them. The diner smelled like early morning, the rich bitterness of coffee, the faint tang of cinnamon from a fresh batch of pie, and the lingering warmth of wood polished through decades of hands and hearts. Ella moved through her tasks with the quiet certainty of someone who had learned to carry a world in small, steady motions, stacking chairs, wiping counters, folding napkins. Millie had retired months ago, handing over the keys with a smile and a gentle nod, leaving Ella with the rhythm of this little sanctuary. Outside, snow fell softly, blanketing the parking lot and the Tetons beyond in a quiet white hush. Light caught the flakes as they drifted, glimmering against the windows, while inside, Ella placed a freshly baked pie on the counter. She paused, resting her hand on the edge of the wooden surface, and glanced toward the photo of her father hanging above the window booth. His lined face, carved with a quiet pride, seemed to watch over the diner, a reminder of the life that had shaped her, of lessons learned through loss and perseverance. She smiled faintly, brushing a wisp of hair behind her ear. The neon sign above the door flickered once, then steadied, casting a warm glow across the floor. Its red light painted gentle patterns on the chairs and tables, reminding her of the countless mornings and evenings she had spent here, pouring coffee, listening to conversations, and holding small pieces of everyone's stories in her heart. The town had moved on from the brief whispers of a diner romance with a man named James Hartwell. Conversations about his wealth, his sudden appearances, his fleeting presence, all of it had quieted. But she still carried him in subtle ways. In the tilt of a cup, the quiet corners of the diner, the shadow of memories resting lightly between dishes and steam. She was straightening chairs when a movement outside caught her attention. Snow swirled gently along the sidewalk, disturbed only by one tall figure trudging through the fresh powder. A man paused at the door, brushing his coat free of the soft white dust. He was tall, shoulders squared yet cautious, with a slight silver streak at his temples, a figure that felt both familiar and impossible. Ella's heart skipped. She froze mid-step, hand hovering over a coffee mug. Recognition swelled in her chest, fragile and warm. It was him. James. Older, quieter, the weight of years resting in the careful way he moved. He paused for a moment, surveying the diner with tentative eyes, then stepped inside. The bell above the door chimed, cutting softly through the hum of conversation. The room felt larger, yet smaller at the same time, filled with the weight of years that had passed yet had not erased the bond they shared. Ella placed the mug she had been holding back on the counter, steadying herself against the swell of emotion that threatened to unbalance her. Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat, the diner and the world beyond it fell away. The chatter of customers, the clink of spoons, the low murmur of conversation, all faded into nothing. It was as if time had compressed into this single, quiet recognition. She could see it in the way he hesitated, the slight dip of his head, the careful way he removed his gloves. He looked at her with eyes that held both apology and relief, acknowledgement and longing. "Coffee?" she asked softly, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. "Black." "No sugar," he replied, a half-smile curling at the corners of his mouth. The words, simple and familiar, carried a weight she hadn't realized she had been holding all these years. She poured the coffee carefully, letting the warmth seep through her hands. She set the cup in front of him, and his eyes followed the motion, resting on hers with an intensity that seemed to pull the years between them into a single thread. He lifted the cup, inhaling the steam before taking a slow sip, savoring the ordinary comfort of it, the quiet ritual that had always meant more than words could convey. Outside, snow continued to fall in soft, rhythmic flakes, coating the streets and mountains in a serene white. Inside, the diner felt timeless, a place untouched by headlines, boardrooms, or gossip. It was their shared haven once again, a space where words were optional and understanding came from silence. Ella noticed a faint tremor in one of his fingers as he held the cup. It was not weakness. It was the weight of life lived in absence, of battles fought alone, of time spent searching for quiet. "I've been everywhere," he said finally, voice low, deliberate, "trying to find quiet. But it's only quiet here." Ella didn't answer. She didn't need to. The words hung between them, a quiet acknowledgement of all they had lost and found, all the years that had carried them apart and now, somehow, together again. She refilled his cup, a simple motion that felt intimate and grounding, and he accepted it with a faint nod, his eyes never leaving hers. The light shifted, catching the snow through the window in a pattern that reminded her of the first winter he had come into the diner, years ago. It was familiar and strange, comforting and melancholic. She could feel the past and present merging, each breath drawn a reminder of how fragile time was, how memory could carry a love quietly, without claim or audience. They sat there, coffee in hand, and the world moved around them, ordinary and unremarkable. And yet, within the quiet, something profound had returned, a gentle recognition that life could still hold moments like this. Stillness, warmth, understanding, and the simple presence of someone who knew the shape of your heart. Outside, the snow fell softly, muffling the world, catching on the neon glow of the diner's sign. Ella breathed, and the weight of years lifted just slightly. She carried the memory of him not as a shadow but as a companion to the present, folded neatly into the rhythm of her mornings. For the first time in years, she allowed herself a small, private smile. The diner, the snow, the aroma of coffee, the familiar warmth of the hearth and wood. It was home. And for the first time in a long time, James was home too. The bell above the door chimed softly as James stepped inside, brushing snow from the shoulders of his coat. He paused for a moment, taking in the diner's familiar warmth, the rich aroma of coffee, the gentle hum of conversation, the sunlight refracting in shards through frost-streaked windows. Everything looked smaller than he remembered, and yet painfully the same. Ella's eyes found his immediately, a quiet recognition that didn't need words. "Coffee?" she asked softly, voice careful, measured. "Black." "No sugar," he replied, and the half-smile she remembered tugged at something long buried. It was the same look he had given her years ago, the look of someone meeting the one person who had known them before the noise of the world. She moved with steady hands, though her heart thumped in a rhythm that made her wonder how she had survived all these years without this simple, ordinary connection. Pouring the dark liquid into the chipped porcelain cup, she set it gently in front of him. His eyes lingered on hers a moment longer than necessary, and in that gaze, she saw a man who had been lost, searching, and finally found again in a place he had never expected. Outside, snow continued to fall in soft, silent sheets. Each flake caught the light in a fleeting shimmer, drifting slowly past the window and onto the slanted streets beyond. Ella's hand trembled slightly as she lifted the coffee pot for a refill. She didn't speak. He didn't ask. They understood that words could be too heavy here, that presence alone could carry the weight of years apart. "Everything changed, I suppose," he said finally, voice low, carrying the cadence of old familiarity and quiet confession. "The world moved, and I kept moving with it, looking for quiet, trying to lose myself somewhere far from everything. And I didn't find it anywhere until now." Ella nodded slowly, careful not to let her throat tighten, careful not to betray how deeply the years apart had carved her. "It's quiet here," she said softly, though the words felt more like observation than reply. James shifted, tucking a lock of hair behind his ear. His eyes roamed the diner for a moment, the worn linoleum floor, the small wooden tables, the counter with its chipped paint and coffee stains. It was a small world, a fragile world. And yet, it was the world where they had met, where their lives had intertwined without notice, without claim. "I've been everywhere," he continued, voice catching slightly. "From the cities that never sleep to the mountains that barely remember a single soul passing through. But it's only quiet here. Only here did I find the space to breathe without hearing the weight of everything I've built pressing down." Ella's hand hovered over the coffee pot. She didn't answer. She refilled his cup again, letting the warmth pass between them, letting the quiet speak instead of words. Tremors of old emotions stirred, relief, longing, grief, joy, all folded into the rhythm of pouring coffee, the clink of the cup against the saucer, the way the steam rose and curled into the cold morning air. They slid into the booth by the window, the same one they had shared long ago. The sun had shifted lower, casting golden stripes across the table, across his face. Lines had formed around his eyes, silver touched his hair at the temples, but the core of him, the part that had once found peace in her presence, remained. For a long while, they didn't speak. The snow whispered against the glass. The faint bell above the door marked the coming and going of townsfolk, and the diner exhaled in steady rhythm. The world outside had changed, but in this small space, time had folded itself back neatly, as if the years between them could be ignored for this single precious moment. He leaned forward slightly, resting his hands around the cup. "I didn't know if I would ever come back here," he said quietly. "Not because I didn't want to, but because I was afraid. Afraid that this, us, couldn't exist outside of memory. That you would have moved on, and I would have been just a ghost." Ella swallowed, forcing calm where her chest thudded with the echo of his words. I kept things the way they were," she admitted softly, "because some part of me thought you might come back. That maybe quiet existed in small doses, in little moments like this." He nodded, eyes glimmering with something between awe and sorrow. "It does. It does exist here. Only here. You were the only part of my life I didn't ruin with ambition, with noise. You reminded me who I was before it all became too much." Her hands traced the rim of her cup, lingering on its warmth, the small imperfections in its glaze. She remembered the nights they had shared quietly, the snow falling beyond the diner windows, the words unspoken but felt deeply. Those nights had been theirs alone, brief and fragile, yet enduring in the quiet memory of each gesture, a hand brushing hers, a shared laugh, a whispered thank you. She began, then paused. Words failed her, as they always did when the weight of time and absence pressed against fragile hope. Instead, she simply refilled his cup one last time, her fingers brushing the edge of his in a fleeting, deliberate motion. The contact was minimal, but it carried years of emotion. Longing, forgiveness, acknowledgement. He met her gaze and nodded slightly, as if he understood everything without needing her to speak. The snow fell harder now, thick flakes gathering on the windowsill. Light and shadow shifted as the diner's neon sign flickered softly, painting faint patterns on the table between them. It was a quiet reflection of the first winter they had met, a winter when everything had begun with coffee and conversation, when the world had seemed large, cold, and unyielding, and yet, in each other's presence, small and safe. James rested his hands on the table, fingers lightly splayed, hesitant to close the distance further. "I didn't come back to change the past," he said quietly, voice steady with honesty. "I came back because I needed to know if peace still exists anywhere. And for me it does. Here. Now." Ella let out a slow breath, feeling the tension in her shoulders ease. She allowed herself a small smile, one measured in years of restraint and careful expectation. Peace. Quiet. Something they had both carried separately, and now shared in a fragile, unspoken acknowledgement. Outside, snow continued to blanket the streets, muffling the sounds of cars, footsteps, distant voices. Inside, the diner exhaled in rhythm with them, the clink of cups and hum of conversation creating a lull that felt sacred, intimate, like the world had paused to allow their reconciliation in quiet, without interruption. He lifted his cup, offering a faint, almost shy smile. "Thank you," he whispered, voice low enough that it might have been carried away by the soft wind outside. Ella's hand hovered briefly before she let it rest against her own cup, warmth seeping through porcelain and skin alike. "Thank you," she replied, voice barely audible. Words had been unnecessary for years. Now, they felt both sufficient and incomplete. The diner's window framed the falling snow, mirroring the quiet from the night they had first shared laughter and secret conversations. Only now, time sat between them, gentle yet insistent, a reminder that some things endure not because they remain constant, but because they are remembered with care. They sat like that for a long while, sipping coffee, letting the quiet fill the spaces between them. There was no need for plans, no demands for explanations, no insistence on solving what had been broken. In that booth, beneath the light, with snow drifting in the cold air outside, they simply existed, two lives intersecting again in fragile, perfect alignment. And in that fragile perfection, the truth was clear. Sometimes, the most profound reconciliations come not with sweeping gestures or declarations, but in quiet acknowledgement, in shared coffee, in the simple act of being seen and recognized again. Ella glanced down briefly at the cup in her hand, then out the window, and for a fleeting moment, she saw all the years that had passed, not as regrets, but as markers leading back to this exact moment. Quiet, fragile, real. The snow continued to fall outside, mirroring the memory of that first day he had entered her diner, and she understood, with a tender ache, that some reunions are felt more deeply than they are spoken. And this was one of them. The diner was quieter than usual that afternoon, the kind of quiet that felt deliberate, almost sacred. Outside, the snow had slowed, leaving a pale layer over the street. Inside, Ella moved behind the counter with the ease of habit, her hands brushing the worn wood, the scent of coffee comforting in its familiarity. And then she saw him, James, standing by the door, coat dusted with the light snow that had begun again, eyes fixed gently on her. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice steady but soft, carrying the rhythm of years and distance. "Black." "No sugar," he replied with the same half-smile that had haunted her memory, familiar as a melody she had almost forgotten. His presence was steady, subdued, as though he were testing the air before stepping fully into it. Ella set the cup before him, noticing the small hesitations, the way he held himself differently now. Older, yes, but lighter somehow, as if the weight of the world had been lifted just enough for him to breathe. The years of ambition, the constant demand of the boardroom, the ceaseless pressures, they had softened at last. "I sold everything," he said quietly, voice low enough that only she could hear. "Years ago. Moved out to Montana. Started again. With my hands. Something I could touch, something I could create. Nothing to measure me against, nothing to break me with." Ella nodded, her heart tightening. "And you never married?" He shook his head. "I didn't know how to love quietly after you. Everything else was noise. Everything else distracted me from knowing what really mattered. I spent too long thinking I could fill the quiet with something else, and it never worked." She swallowed, emotions rolling in waves she hadn't expected to feel all at once. Years of longing, of missing a presence that had shaped her in ways she hadn't fully acknowledged, surged into the small space between them. And yet, there was no blame here, no recrimination. Just understanding, gentle and profound. "I kept your letter," she admitted, her voice soft, almost trembling. "And the notebook. I never opened it. Not really. I wanted to keep it, in case one day you came back." His eyes glimmered with a mixture of gratitude and tenderness. He reached across the table, just a simple motion, his fingers brushing hers lightly. The contact was minimal, but it carried decades of unspoken confession, of love restrained and preserved carefully in memory. "Then maybe we both found home after all," he said, voice low, carrying the weight of years now made lighter. His smile was small, full of the relief that comes from being known, being accepted, and being finally able to step away from the world that had demanded everything else from him. The diner was silent except for the clink of cups and the faint hum of the heating vent. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the glass and lifting a few loose napkins, sending them tumbling like small paper ghosts across the floor. One of them slid near her hand, and she caught it without thought, a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. It reminded her of the first note he had ever left her, folded neatly beneath the sugar jar, an unspoken invitation into a world she hadn't known she could enter. James finished his coffee, set the cup down carefully, and reached for his coat. He dropped a 20 on the counter, the gesture casual, ordinary, but somehow deeply familiar. Their eyes met for a long moment, steady, calm, and full of peace rather than pain. In that look, they both acknowledged everything they had been, everything they had missed, and everything they had finally allowed themselves to feel. He opened the door, and a gust of wind swept through the diner, stirring the napkins and the corners of papers on the counter. The motion was subtle, fleeting, but it echoed a memory of the snow, of the quiet nights, of the fragile beginnings of their connection. He stepped outside, and for a heartbeat, Ella watched him fade into the pale winter light. The bell above the door jingled faintly as it closed behind him, leaving the diner in silence, soft and heavy with everything unspoken. Ella rested her hands on the counter, feeling the warmth of the wood through her palms, grounding herself in the rhythm of a world that had changed but held onto familiar corners. She breathed deeply, letting the quiet fill her chest, letting the memory of his presence linger without needing to claim it. For a while, She simply watched the snowfall outside, the light falling in gentle stripes across the counter. She thought about the years, the moments of small connection that had been their secret world, the late nights behind the diner, the snow swirling outside the cabin, the moments of laughter and whispered confessions. Those moments had never belonged to anyone else, and now, finally, they belonged only to her memory, intact and precious. She opened the notebook one last time, fingers tracing the smooth, empty pages. On the final page, the words he had written so long ago glimmered in her mind. "Home is where someone remembers you." She let a soft smile form, heart lightened by the knowledge that some loves don't need to be claimed publicly to be real. They simply exist, in memory, in quiet acknowledgement, in small gestures that endure even after absence. Ella replaced the notebook under the counter, careful and deliberate, tucking it where it had first started, hidden, yet waiting, just as they had once waited for each other. There was no need to revisit it, no need to open it again. Some stories are best preserved quietly, tucked away where they can be remembered without interference, cherished without complication. Outside, the wind swirled, lifting flakes of snow and carrying them across the street. Inside, the diner lights glowed steady against the gray of late afternoon, warm and enduring. Life moved forward in its familiar rhythm. Coffee poured, doors opened, conversations murmured. And yet, a piece of quiet magic lingered, a trace of a connection that had shaped two lives without altering their course too heavily, a love that had taught them what it meant to be seen and remembered. James' absence left no ache, only space. Space for memory, for reflection, and for the quiet understanding that some bonds, though fleeting in presence, endure endlessly in significance. Ella took a slow breath, setting her hands firmly on the counter, and let the snowflakes settle against the glass like delicate reminders that life, like love, often leaves its marks in subtle, almost invisible ways. For a moment, she allowed herself to simply exist in that quiet warmth, letting the memory of him and the reality of his return coexist peacefully. They had found a way to honor what they shared without needing the world to understand it, without needing public recognition or explanation. Their home was not a place or a name or even a cup of coffee. It was the trust, the memory, and the quiet knowledge that they had mattered profoundly to each other. She glanced once more at the window, letting her eyes follow the snow drifting lazily to the ground. The diner hummed around her, ordinary and comforting. The bell above the door would ring again, customers would come, orders would be called out, coffee poured, conversations held, but none of it would erase what had been theirs, quietly and completely, in the space between words and gestures, glances and silences. And in that knowledge, Ella felt a serene weight lift from her shoulders. The past had not been rewritten, the years had not been erased, but the pain of absence had softened, replaced with understanding. Acceptance, gentle and honest, filled her chest as she let herself lean on the rhythm of ordinary life, carrying quietly the extraordinary truth that she had loved and had been loved, in ways that no one else would ever see but that she would always remember. The diner lights flickered softly with the waning afternoon sun, casting gentle shadows across the counter and tables. Outside, the wind picked up again, stirring loose napkins and the edges of menus. A single flake of snow caught in the sunlight, glimmering briefly before melting, a small, perfect echo of the life and love that had passed quietly between them. Ella exhaled slowly, resting her forehead briefly on her hands. Some loves, she realized, do not belong to the world. They belong to the spaces they touched, the moments they created, and the memories that endure. And perhaps that was the truest kind of home. Quiet, unclaimed, and yet profoundly unforgettable. She lifted her head, hands brushing the counter smooth, and carried on with her day. The diner was alive with its small rhythm again, ordinary yet extraordinary, steady and welcoming. The quiet warmth lingered in her chest, and she knew it would, quietly, for the rest of her life. Snow still fell in slow, deliberate patterns outside the diner windows, painting the world in shades of silver and white. The clock above the counter ticked softly, steady and unhurried, the sound of time itself breathing. The breakfast rush had long passed, the chatter and clinking of cups now replaced by the quiet hum of solitude. Ella stood behind the counter, her hands wrapped around a warm mug. The steam curled upward, tracing invisible patterns before disappearing into the soft yellow light. Everything felt both familiar and distant, as though the diner had stood still while the years moved around it. She looked toward the booth by the window, the one James had always chosen. The faint imprint of his cup remained on the table, a ring of coffee drying into memory. The snow beyond that glass had not changed much. It fell the same way it always did, gentle, unassuming, endless. But she had changed. In the silence, she could almost hear his voice again, that low, thoughtful tone, the pauses between his words. He had walked away for the last time, but this time, it didn't ache the way it used to. It didn't break her. It simply was. Some endings didn't arrive with pain, only peace, and the understanding that not all love stories were meant to stay open forever. Ella reached beneath the counter, her hand brushing against the old leather notebook. It had become smooth with time, the corners soft and worn. She hadn't opened it since that last day. For a moment, she hesitated, feeling the familiar hesitation tug at her, the fear of stirring something too delicate to touch. But then, gently, she flipped it open. The pages whispered softly as they turned, most still blank, empty spaces that had once felt like waiting. And there, at the very end, was his line. "Home is where someone remembers you." She traced the words with her fingertip, her throat tightening, but this time it wasn't sorrow she felt. It was gratitude, a quiet, enduring kind of thankfulness that came from having lived something rare, something real. She reached for a pen. For a long moment, she sat still, the ink hovering just above the page. Then, in slow, deliberate handwriting, she added a final line beneath his. "And sometimes, home is where someone once waited for you." She looked at the words, her own and his, side by side, a conversation across time. Together, they felt complete, like two sides of the same truth. Closing the notebook, she placed it gently under the counter, right where it had begun, the same spot where years ago she'd first found his note scribbled on a napkin. Life had a strange way of circling back, not to repeat itself, but to offer quiet closure. Outside, a wind gusted, brushing snowflakes against the glass like tiny whispers. The diner lights glowed against the frost, steady and warm, a small beacon against the gray. Ella poured another cup of coffee, out of habit more than need, and let the scent fill the air. She thought about everything that had passed, the laughter behind the diner, the long nights by the fire, the silence of the cabin the morning he left. Each moment had built her, not through romance alone, but through the strength that came after it. The bell above the door jingled, a small, bright sound that cut through the hush. A young man stepped in, shaking snow from his jacket, his cheeks flushed from the cold. He looked uncertain for a moment, then smiled. "Afternoon," he said softly. "Is it too late for breakfast?" Ella smiled, setting a menu before him. "It's never too late for breakfast." He laughed quietly, the sound fresh and familiar all at once. As she poured his coffee, she realized how natural it felt, how easily life kept moving, carrying new faces, new stories, without erasing the old ones. The diner returned to its rhythm, the soft scrape of a fork, the hiss of the griddle, the muted murmur of life continuing. But beneath it all, there was a stillness, not emptiness, but peace. The kind that comes when every piece of the past has found its place. Ella glanced again toward the window. Outside, the snowfall deepened, each flake catching a hint of golden light as the afternoon sun began to fade. The world was hushed, wrapped in a quiet beauty that asked for nothing but to be noticed. For a long time she stood there, watching, the soft reflection of the diner lights shimmering in the glass. Her world, steady and unchanged, yet full of ghosts made gentle by memory. She wasn't waiting anymore. Not for James, not for the echo of what had been. She was simply remembering, holding space for something beautiful that had already done its work. The past, she realized, didn't always have to fade. Sometimes it stayed quietly beside you, not to haunt, but to remind that love, even unfinished, could still be whole. She refilled the coffee pot, moving with unhurried grace, her face calm, her heart steady. Outside, the snow continued to fall, endless, soft, and indifferent to time. And then, softly, almost imperceptibly, a thought drifted through her mind, the words she would never speak aloud but carried deeply, like a prayer meant only for herself. Some loves don't belong to the world. They belong to time, and to the silence that keeps them safe. She smiled faintly, almost to herself, as she set down the pot. The sound of the diner, the low murmur, the scrape of a spoon, the faint hum of the heater, folded around her like an old, familiar song. The young man by the window thanked her, his voice kind. She nodded, her eyes warm but distant, as if she could see both the present and the past layered together. And perhaps she could. The bell above the door chimed again, letting in another rush of winter air. Somewhere outside, laughter echoed faintly, the world carrying on, the way it always had. Ella looked once more toward the counter where the old notebook lay hidden. She didn't need to touch it again. The story inside it had found its ending, and so had she. The diner lights glowed against the snow, their warmth defying the cold, steady and sure, like the memory of something once deeply loved, now gently at peace. And as the snow continued to fall, covering the world in quiet white, Ella breathed in deeply and let the moment hold her. She wasn't waiting anymore. She was home. Some loves don't belong to the world. They belong to time, and to the silence that keeps them safe. If this story touched you, let us know where you're watching from and hit subscribe. Your support keeps these stories alive. Thank you for being part of our storytelling family.